Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined today by my brother, the Gritty Broman. How are you, Brent?
I'm well. Thank you.
Good. We're Zooming the podcast. What is that?
What? Did I tell you about that?
No.
I burned my hand.
Ouch.
Check that out, folks. Yeah. I was seasoning a skillet the other day.
That's a serious blister, dude.
Right? So my towel had a vertical cut in it, and I didn't realize that. So I grabbed it with the towel, but the metal just snuck right through that one little tiny little line. Got me good. Yeah, check that out. You want to touch it?
No, I don't. I don't, actually.
I get that reaction a lot this week.
Yeah, that looks disgusting. So you just let it just fester like that? You don't want to, burst it
Dude,
or anything?
I can't tell you how many people want to pop this. Especially women. Women have a thing for popping things.
Yeah, I think it's smart to leave it the way it is.
Yeah, as long as I can.
Yeah. So,
but
folks,
if you see me play with my hand, that's what I'm doing.
Welcome back to the podcast. We're getting back into the River of Doubt. We're with Theodore Roosevelt's darkest journey. Where we left off last, Theodore Roosevelt had become severely ill due to the infection of his leg and just said, I'm stopping here. My son Kermit, Cherry, everybody leave me here in the jungle. I've got a little vial of morphine.
I'm good to go.
He's like, I'm out. It's over. And that's where we left off.
That's not a bad way to go.
So he's in the jungle. He's, 50, 55? I mean, he's not that old, actually. But yet he has lived a very wild and full life. And the book made that clear at the beginning or toward the end of the chapter there, Roosevelt had these adventures. He was kind of getting tired of, he was like, if I were to go now, I feel like I've lived a full life and I'm okay with that. That's the risk I took when I came on this journey and the risk I take when I go on every journey. And he has that quote where he says, the people who are fit to live are those who are not afraid to die. What he said is,
those who are fit to live are fit to die.
Are ready to die.
Are ready to die.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about it. He served as a president. He served as a colonel or in multiple wars. He was part of the...
Only those are fit to live who do not fear to die.
There it is. We could have just looked it up in the first place. I don't know.
But the point is, he's saying that, to live, you have to not be afraid to die. And if you're always afraid of dying, you can't live. It just reminds me of all that COVID stuff. People staying at home, locked in their houses, afraid to leave, won't travel. That's not life to me. That's not living to me. It's like you have to go out into the world and risk death to live. That's called life. Mm-hmm. And you're going to manage the risk best you can. But this whole thing where people would rather stay in a cage and be safe than be in the wild and live free. It's like when you take a lion and you lock it in a cage in the zoo. A lion doesn't belong in a cage. And it might live way longer there than it would in the wild, but can you really call it living?
For me, I'm going to switch your analogy around. You have a wolf and you have a pug. All right? A pug is trying to just live, and it's not doing anything. Is it really living?
You just wrecked my analogy.
I don't think so.
So the lion
with a better analogy
is free. That is in the jungle. That's a life. The lion in a cage is existing but not living. And by being out in the wild, it might die.
Years earlier,
10 years earlier, but it lived a life worth living. The trait is worth it. And my whole point is live, get outside and live. And if you die at age 40 instead of age 80, but you had a full life, like I'd make that trade. You got to prioritize. Existence isn't all it's cracked up to be.
No, living longer sometimes sounds terrible.
Anyway, we need to get back to the book. But before we do that, I want to remind you guys, if you're looking for a knife, you should go check out Goat Knives and use the code GrittyGoat. We got two right here in studio. This is the two-handled version, where or not the two-handled. This is where has the removable blade version. But I actually like the solid one that Brent has right here in his hand. It's all one solid piece. That's my favorite. So go to Goat Knives. Use the code GrittyGoat. It's made with Nitro V steel. We use this neck sheath. Put it around our neck right here. Hangs like that. It's a lot cheaper than one of my other favorite knives, which is the Benchmade Altitude. Mm-hmm. This sharpens a little more easily, but it holds an edge a long time. I like the design. I like the shape of it. It's a great knife. Go to Goat Knives and use the code GrittyGoat and get yourself a goat knife. And as always, support us by going to Mountain Ops. Get yourself some Blaze, some Ignite, some Yeti. Check out the Merino hoodies. I use those all the time. Use the code Gritty. That supports us as well. And then Stealthy Nutrition, Stealthy Rifle Cover, Stealthy Glassing Pads. Check those out. Go to Stealthy and use the code Gritty over there. And all of that stuff helps us keep doing what we do. We appreciate your support. Okay, Brent. Chapter 23. Missing.
Who's missing?
But it's in section 5, which is called Despair.
I was like, because you flipped that over to missing. I was like, well, I thought it was despair. I was reading despair this whole time.
So here we go. Thousands of miles away in New York City, Roosevelt's family and friends had begun to fear the worst. They had been prepared to lose contact with Roosevelt for several weeks, perhaps even months. They were not prepared, however, for news that they had received on March 23rd when the New York Times announced that Roosevelt had lost everything in the rapids of the River of Doubt, and that his whereabouts were unknown. Accompanying the article was a large but strikingly complete map of Mato Grosso, Brazil, the region through which Roosevelt was known to be traveling, and a picture of the former president framed in a circle in the left-hand corner. A series of 14 headlines filled much of the far right-handed column, spilling down the page in a cascade of speculation and fragments of misinformation, of information. Quote, maybe on unknown river, one headline read. District never explored. Quote, party had been divided. Quote, no word yet to family.
They don't have mail service. No, duh, you're not getting word to the family.
The article had been sparked by a telegram that Anthony Fiala, the expedition outfitter, the failed outfitter who was working at Abercrombie and Fitch, had sent to the newspaper the day before from Santarém, Brazil, a relatively large town on the Amazon River, to which he had made his way after successfully descending the Papagaio River. The telegram was only 2 sentences long, but it was notable both for its brief but startling description of a disaster in the rapids and its omission of any news about Theodore Roosevelt. We have lost everything in the rapids, Fiala had written. Telephone my wife of my safety. At that time, no one outside of the expedition, including even Fiala's wife, knew that Fiala had been bumped from the descent of the River of Doubt and relegated to a different journey. They assumed that the quartermaster was still with the expedition he had outfitted, and that because he had lost everything, so had Roosevelt. So remember, they split up.
Yeah.
And the people that they didn't feel could cut it, they kind of sent down this safe river.
Fiala was out, 2 weeks? Not long.
And Roosevelt went down this other river. And so everyone who kind of had got themselves, they had portages everything out to the River of Doubt through the jungle, which was nasty and way harder than they planned and took forever. Once they got out there, though, they split up and these guys went back. Fiala's group went back. So right now, nobody quite knows that Fiala is not with Roosevelt. And so now they're intercepting these telegrams and seeing all this stuff, and they're just assuming whatever had befallen Fiala also had happened to Theodore. The newspaper did its best to reassure its readers that Roosevelt was probably safe. The fact that Fiala had not mentioned Roosevelt, the article argued, was a good sign rather than a bad one. Mr. Fiala's silence on the subject indicates that the colonel is safe. These people are just selling newspapers. I mean, even back then, they're just like,
we're just going to fudge it a little bit. Keep the masses chill.
Let's just like freak everybody out, have fake headlines. Let's just do fake news. Or this is news about nothing, really.
It was a slow news cycle, Brian.
The understanding with Mr. Fiala was that any personal injury to the colonel was to be cabled immediately and fully. So here, this didn't help the family. They were wondering why they didn't mention Roosevelt. Since her return from South America in December, Margaret's death just a few weeks later, Edith had tried to find distractions that would keep her too busy to worry about her husband and son, but she was struggling. Earlier in the year, she had moved into a hotel in New York City so that she could be near her daughter Ethel during the final moments of Ethel's first pregnancy. After the baby was born on March 7th, Edith had stayed in the city for another week to help her daughter. She had then traveled to Groton, the prestigious boarding school in northern Massachusetts, which all of the Roosevelt boys had attended, to witness her youngest son Quentin's confirmation. 10 days later, on March 25, she had finally returned to Sagamore Hill, her peaceful but conspicuously empty home on Oyster Bay. Edith had been at Groton when Fiala's telegram reached the New York Times. By then, she had not heard from her husband in nearly a month. So she's in the dark. They speculate. I'm going to skip ahead because, basically you get the idea. They didn't know if he was killed by man-eating fish and warlike Indians, and there's all these rumors, and everybody's writing about it now. And they're just making Edith multiply her fear in her mind that her son and her husband are dead. While Edith had spent much of her life worrying about her husband, Theodore, because Theodore had roamed the world in search of adventure and achievement, never showing much concern about leaving his family. After his first wife's death, he had left his infant daughter in his sister Mamie's care and fled to the Dakota Territories. At the start of the Spanish-American War, he had struggled. He had wanted to fight. Basically, she had dealt with this, right? Mm-hmm. But one thing she hadn't really dealt with as much was Kermit. Not only was her husband out on this journey, but her son as well, her youngest, right? So the fact that Kermit had put his wedding and his life on hold for this expedition had weighed heavily on Roosevelt from the beginning of their journey. I wish he would have gone straight to Belle. He had written Ethel. So Kermit, there was a lot going on with Kermit's fiance and his mother being worried while they're gone. Although she missed Kermit, Belle, for her part, had not been suffering during the months of the expedition as her fiance and her mother-in-law had. Scratch that. I guess his fiance wasn't all that worried. As Kermit fought for his own and his father's survival on the River of Doubt, Belle happily settled into her new role as the fiance of a Roosevelt, while continuing to live her life as a transatlantic aristocrat. From her hotel in Madrid, she traveled to New York, made trips into neighboring France, and while there, occasionally crossed the English Channel. In London, she had been presented to the court of St. James. In January, with a brief cable to their friends back in Richmond, basically Belle's parents had announced their daughter's engagement. A few days after Fiala's disturbing telegram had appeared in the New York Times, Belle and her mother had been spotted in Paris, happily shopping for her
French word, gross,
for her clothes. When a correspondent for the Washington Post inquired, Belle smilingly admitted the nature of her errand. Less than 2 weeks later, she was back in New York attending the opera with her anxious future mother-in-law. Belle sounds like, she's deeply in love here.
Learn to spell.
Yeah. Trousseau.
Trousseau.
Mm-hmm.
Trousseau. They didn't spell the same word twice, bro. The clothes, household linen, and other belongings collected by a bride for her marriage.
Okay. So basically, yeah, she's not all that. She's kind of having a party while he's gone, and not too worried about Kermit. But during the expedition, Kermit's longing for Belle had only deepened. On the overland journey, he used to break away from the rest of the expedition to go hunting with his big white mule and his beloved dog Trigueiro. He particularly loved the vast, empty deserts of the Brazilian highlands, where he could wander alone, dreaming of Belle. The desert has always been a good friend of mine, he had once tried to explain to her. Belle could have had no doubt as to the intensity of Kermit's feelings for her, for he had written to her until he had finally run out of stationery as he made his way across the highlands to the River of Doubt, and he had never failed to tell her how much he ached for her. "You must be getting very tired of hearing me say how lonely I am for you," he had written in late January. "But it's what I am all the whole time, and I can't keep it out of my letters. Oh, Belle, dearest, dearest one, it just seems too good to believe that we'll ever be together." Reading Kermit's letters, it is difficult to remember that he barely knew Belle. Not only were the two young expatriates separated by thousands of miles, but they were fundamentally different people. Kermit and Belle's childhoods and the expectations placed upon them by their parents could not have been more different. They both came from wealthy, well-known families, but Belle had been raised in the rarefied world of high society, whereas Kermit, although the son of a president, had spent most of his childhood tearing through the woods of Oyster Bay. Even Roosevelt's sister had commented that she never knew of such a badly brought-up family. Instead of stressing things like table manners, he himself was a notoriously sloppy eater. Roosevelt had expected his sons to know how to shoot a gun, skin a rabbit, and chop down a tree.
It sounds like great family values. I'm waiting to hear the negativities.
Even when his family lived in the White House, he had winked at his children's mischievousness, even mildly destructive adventures. Kermit, who had been 12 years old when his father became president, had regularly brought his kangaroo rat with him in his pocket to breakfast, and his younger brother, Archie, had used the passenger elevator to transport his pony to the second floor. The house became one general playground for the Roosevelt children and their associates, Irwin Hoover, a longtime White House employee, once wrote. "Nothing was too sacred to be used for their amusement, and no place too good for a playroom." The children seemed to be encouraged in these ideas by their elders, and it was a brave man indeed who would dare say no or suggest putting a stop to those escapades. Sounds like my house.
As you say, it sounds like growing up.
Yeah,
minus the animals.
And even then,
there were some exceptions.
Even then, I had plenty of animals in the house.
I got gypped. I got a potbelly pig as a pet, Brian.
Dude, you're going to complain about that? I mean, come on.
Hey,
it was Grease. What was his name? Bubbles, Lightning, or
Bubbles, Baking, Lightning, Shadow, Junior Call. Brian, get it right. I was very indecisive as a child. People, I couldn't stick with one name.
So, but yeah, we kind of grew up in the same way. I got to clear my throat here. So, what do you think?
It's good
so far.
It's a good one.
I mean, I'm asking you, what do you think?
Oh, I don't see the problem here. So Kermit's cool and her family's boring. That's
that's kind of how I'm seeing it.
That's how I'm seeing it.
So the Roosevelt men were rough around the edges, but they were also vulnerable to what Roosevelt's older daughter Alice characterized as melancholic streak that she believed ran in the family. Of all of Roosevelt's sons, Kermit was perhaps at greatest risk of falling prey to his family melancholy. Although he was smart and strong, he did not have his father's ability to forge his own happiness. Even Edith, Kermit's greatest admirer, acknowledged that there was a dark side to her blond son. In a letter that she had written to Roosevelt's sister Bamie just months earlier, she had referred to Kermit as the one with the white head and the black heart. Her second son, she had once explained, had always been odd and independent and had seemed to prefer his own company to any other, which, with the occasional exception of his mother's. He never need retire to a cloister for a life of abstraction from outside interests, Edith had once written to her sister Emily. "I believe I am the only person he really cares for." While at Groton, Kermit had also begun to drink heavily enough at times for even the rector, Endicott Peabody, to notice.
Mr. Peabody.
When Peabody confronted Kermit, the young man had become so angry that he had thought that he and the rector were going to come to blows. So, Kermit had a brooding temperament. Mm-hmm. So did most of the Roosevelts, actually. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like, and the melancholy and the depression that they would struggle with, it sounded like they just suffered from depression. Mm-hmm. They would have they're a bit manic. They'd have extreme highs and extreme lows. They weren't all that even keeled. And to accomplish what Theodore Roosevelt did in the short time that he was on this earth, it goes to show like the man was just intense. He was go, 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 go all the time. And,
I imagine like 5 Robin Williams living in a house together.
Right. I think so. Like just some intensity there that up, down, up, down, up, down. What you don't see often are the downs when you're in the pub. When the public doesn't see the downs, but they're there. And, you see people who struggle with this and this melancholy. Theodore, we read The Wilderness. What is that one called? The Wilderness
Warrior?
Wilderness Warrior, which is a book about Roosevelt. We covered that a couple years ago on the podcast. And in that, we read about Theodore having that tendency to go into the mountains or to go off and have adventures as his therapy for his depression, his melancholy, to fight it. The outdoors was clearly the struggle and the adventure was clearly what he needed to feel alive or to get himself out of sadness, is to be doing stuff, to be active, to experience new things. And I think that's when people go and they get help for depression, often one of the first things they tell people to do that are suffering from depression is exercise, just physical movement, just get out and do things with your body. But somehow or another, Roosevelt found ways to overcome his melancholy, derived happiness and drive out of his life, where, Kermit didn't seem to be able to do it. Kermit's brooding temperament and early taste for alcohol were character traits that Roosevelt had seen in his only brother, Elliot, who had died at the age of 34 from complications related to alcoholism and morphine addiction. In childhood, Elliot had been as charming and lighthearted as his older brother had been awkward and serious. He had been the stronger, taller, more athletic of the 2 Roosevelt boys, but as he had approached adolescence, Elliot had begun to lose his footing, developing as one biography put it, an inclination toward poetic introspection and a desire for solitude that was hauntingly similar to that of his future nephew. When their father died in 1878, Theodore, who had been at Harvard and had not witnessed the horrible ravages brought on by the final stages of cancer, was devastated. Elliot, who had been at their father's side throughout his illness, nearly lost his mind. Elliot gave unstintedly a devotion which was so tender that it was more like that of a woman, their sister Corinne recalled, and his young strength was poured out to help his father's condition. Theodore Sr.'s final days stayed with Elliot for the rest of his short life. He was so mad with pain, he would later remember with horror, that beyond groans and horrible writhes and twists he could do nothing. Oh my God, my father was what agonies you suffered.
Damn.
4 years later, Elliot fell in love with a young society beauty named Anna Hall, who, like Belle Willard, came from a wealthy, well-connected family. Just as Belle now seemed to Kermit almost untouchable in her perfection, so did Elliot romanticize and idealize Anna. She seems to me so pure and so high and ideal that in my roughness and unworthiness I do not see how I can make her happy, Elliot wrote. In December 1883, Elliot and Anna married. 2 months later, Theodore lost his young wife, Alice, to Bright's disease. Theodore survived the tragedy, but Elliot, who seemingly had everything he could have hoped for, slowly unraveled. He and Anna had 3 children, among them Eleanor, who grew up to marry her distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But their marriage was a travesty. As the years passed, Elliot sank progressively deeper into alcoholism, morphine addiction, and a series of scandalous affairs that humiliated his proud wife and alienated his puritanical brother. In the end, Theodore simply gave up on Elliot. He finally had his brother admitted to an asylum in Paris and declared incompetent and insane.
Dang.
The next year, Anna died of diphtheria at the age of 29, refusing to see her husband even on her deathbed. Had Elliot been a stronger man, the sorrow and shame surrounding his wife's early death might have turned his life around, but he was not, and it did not. 2 years later, Theodore wrote to Bammy that he wished their sister Corinne could get a little of my hard heart about Elliot. He can't be helped, and he must simply be let go his own gait. He is now laid up from a serious fall. While drunk, he drove into a lamppost and went out on his head. Poor fellow. If only he could have died instead of Anna.
Speaking of seatbelt laws.
Elliot did die less than a month later, leaving 9-year-old Eleanor and her 2 siblings orphans.
Dang.
For Roosevelt, Elliot's death transported him back in time to 20 years earlier when his brother was still a handsome, charming boy with a bright smile and a promising future. I only need have pleasant thoughts of Elliot now, he wrote his sister Corinne. He is just the gallant, generous, manly, loyal young man whom everyone loved. When Roosevelt saw his brother's body, he was more overcome than I have ever seen him, Corinne later recalled. He cried like a little boy for a long time. You know, I'm 47 years old, getting there, getting older all the time. And we all know people who had so much of a bright future ahead of them, you know, had so much going for them, so much, you know, potential that then we see, you know, their lives unravel through what life brings, whether it be depression, you know, or addiction, different things that people struggle with. And as I've gone through life, I found like one of the greatest challenges I think one can undertake is to keep trying to improve throughout your whole life. Mm-hmm. You know, you never quit, you never give up. You always start from where you are and try to become better than you were the day before. And I've seen so many people in my life that were so wonderful, and then they hit a certain age and it's like they just quit or reverted, went into a state of weakness, where they just never, all that potential was gone. You know, and Theodore clearly, he hit a point where he's like, his brother was still alive, but he more or less was dead to him. I've let him go. He's better off dead than alive, and I'm not going to enable him to stick around either. When he sees his brother, you know, he's basically saying, you know, he remembered the young version, the special version, the bright version, and you know that's that he missed, and he felt bad. But at the end of the day, everyone makes their own decisions. Everyone is in control of their own destiny. Everyone chooses their path. And one of the hardest things I think that people have to live with is you can't make people's decisions for them. You watch your kids grow up and they make choices, and you do your best because you love them to try to help them have the best chance at life. But at the end of the day, they're free agents to choose their own course. And so often you see parents have to watch their kids make bad choices and go down really dark roads of sorrow and misery. And that, I think, is one of the hardest things to do as a parent, is to watch your child make those bad decisions. And here he is, you know, dealing with that. But the point is to show that both Kermit and Elliot had a lot of similarities between them. Throughout Kermit's adolescence and young adult life, Roosevelt had gone to great lengths to keep his son focused and industriously occupied. When Kermit was at Groton, his father, who was then president, always found time to monitor his schoolwork closely. In an attempt to encourage his son in any interest that he himself viewed as positive and worthwhile, Roosevelt had even rescued Edwin Arlington Robinson, the down-and-out American poet to whom Kermit had become devoted while at Groton. After leaving Harvard, Robinson had fallen into obscurity, misery, and alcoholism. Kermit had sent one of Robinson's works to the White House and asked his father if he could help the poet. Although Roosevelt admitted that he did not think he truly understood Robinson's poetry, he not only gave him a position as a special agent in the New York Treasury, but he reviewed the Children of the Night for Outlook magazine. Children of the Night for Outlook, that's the title. Thus bringing his writings to a much wider audience than it had ever had. I do not like to think of where I should be now if it had not been for your astonishing father, Robinson later wrote to Kermit. He fished me out of hell by the hair of my head. Determined to keep his son from descending into blackness that had swallowed Eliot, he had nearly destroyed Robinson. Roosevelt had taken Kermit along on his most challenging adventures and had always given him a mission, something to work toward, something to give him a sense of direction and accomplishment. Besides encouraging Kermit in his schoolwork and literary interests, Roosevelt had exposed him to the physical challenges that had toughened his own body and mind. And you can see how Eliot, had he been pushed into these rigors, maybe he could have pulled through and done better. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, are you just putting off the inevitable? So he takes Kermit to all these different places. He sent him to South Dakota one summer to work in the Badlands that had been his own salvation, that had been Roosevelt's salvation after his first wife died. Africa, too, had been a constant physical challenge, and Roosevelt had watched with soaring pride how his son thrived on the difficult work. We worked hard. Kermit, of course, worked hardest, for he is really a first-class walker and runner. Roosevelt had written proudly from the Sudan to Kermit's brother Archie. Kermit has really become not only an excellent hunter, but also a responsible and trustworthy man fit to lead. Standing next to Roosevelt's prone, sweat-soaked figure in their dim tent beside the River of Doubt, Kermit met his father's decision to take his own life with the same quiet strength and determination that the elder Roosevelt had so carefully cultivated and admired in him. This time, however, the result would be different. For the first time in his life, Kermit simply refused to honor his father's wishes. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would not leave without Roosevelt. In the fraction of a second that passed between Roosevelt's grim declaration and Kermit's reaction, father and son reversed the roles that had defined their relationship, and which neither of them had ever questioned. Over nearly a quarter century, through lectures, letters, camping trips, grand adventures, and a strong example, Roosevelt had molded Kermit in his own image, creating a young man who, given a goal, would fight with everything he had to achieve it. But although Roosevelt was proud of his son's growing independence, he had always remained the patriarch, continuing to make the final decisions. On this night, Kermit not only refused to do what his father asked of him, but demanded that Roosevelt step back and let his son determine his and the entire expedition's course of action. Okay. Recognizing the resolve in his son's face, Roosevelt realized that if he wanted to save Kermit's life, he would have to allow his son to save him. It came to me, and I saw that if I did end it, that would only make it more sure that Kermit would not get out, Roosevelt would later confide to a friend. For I knew he would not abandon me, but would insist on bringing my body out too. That, of course, would have been impossible. I knew his determination, so there was only one thing for me to do, and that was to come out myself. So,
this was a heavy chapter. We're not even in the Amazon.
Yeah. It's pretty intense. So you can see in this one moment, without that context, that Candace Millard, who's the author of this book, adding to it, you wouldn't really know, there's so much subtext behind what's happening here with Roosevelt and Kermit's psyche and personalities and
some history and backstory.
Yeah. And you're talking about people's genetics and tendencies and, uniqueness here. And Kermit's like, no, we're not doing this. I'm not leaving you in the jungle. And it's funny how quickly Roosevelt realizes that he's got to fight to live because
It's the only way his son.
it's the only way his son lives. And it's crazy if you think about it. How much are we willing to do for someone we love that we aren't willing to do for ourselves? You know, Jordan Peterson in 12 Rules for Life, he says, treat yourself like you're someone you're responsible for taking care of.
Mm-hmm.
And how often we treat ourselves badly, you know, diet, exercise, sleep, even self-talk. But if you were responsible for being the caregiver for a certain person, how much better you would treat them than you treat your own self. Sometimes, you know, you're willing to do so much more for someone you love than you are willing to do for you. I think that's where a true marriage, a true loving marriage, where the success of it stems from. I'm willing to do so much more, you know, in terms of taking care of myself because of the love I have for my spouse than I would simply for me. Mm-hmm. Like, I want to be healthy and strong for her more than I do want to do it for me, you know, and vice versa for her. Suzanne wants to be healthy, strong, and there for me. So she takes care of herself much more in concern for my well-being than her own. I think that's one of those things that's noble about this with Theodore is he's going to fight his way out of the jungle, not for him, but for Kermit. And the odds are stacked against him. They shouldn't make it. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't make it at all. Okay, so this next part is pretty crazy. We're going to jump right into this. It says, the worst in a man. This is chapter 24. Theodore Roosevelt had decided to live. In the past, that would have been enough. On the River of Doubt, however, his decision would save him only from himself. He was still perilously ill, and he and his men still faced a deep rocky gorge, an impassable series of rapids, and a commander who believed that their only hope lay in abandoning their canoes and striking out into the pathless jungle. With the growing infection in his leg and his raging fever, Roosevelt knew that he would never be able to survive a forced march through the rainforest, no matter how determined he was to do so. Although he was still strong, his body was not. For the first time in his adult life, Roosevelt would have to rely on someone else's physical strength to put him through. He would have to rely on his son. Kermit had been battling malaria almost endlessly.
Of course he was.
Since the expedition began. But he was still strong, and he had the endless endurance of youth. Having inherited his father's unshakable confidence, Kermit was certain that he could get the expedition's dugouts through the canyon. The problem was convincing the other men. Kermit, Roosevelt would later write, was the only man who believed we could get the canoes down at all. The young man's conviction, however, quickly swayed not just Cherry, but also, even more important, Lyra. The Brazilian navigator had been Rondon's right-hand man for much of his life, but he had spent the past month working side by side with Kermit as they struggled to get past one series of rapids after another. Honestly, you know, Rondon says we can't do it, can't take the rafts. We're just going to have to start bushwhacking our way out, abandon the river. Remember earlier in the book we read about how that went when that guy's tongue got bit off by the piranha. Mm-hmm. Most of his men died trying to just every man for himself make it out of the jungle alive. I don't think it's the best strategy. When Rondon jumps to that plan, I'm just thinking I just think again, this is a valuable lesson to have. It's like it might seem easier at first to just start walking, but in the long run, is it? And I think you learn from what's about to happen that what often I've done this where I'm in the backcountry and it seems like, well, I'll just take this shortcut and I'll just do this thing and get to where I need to be right now. Because right now in the immediate, it's going to be easier than the alternative. And then in the end, it becomes much higher cost than had I just done it the right way the first time. Mm-hmm. So Rondon believed that the effort was a lost cause, but when confronted by these three men and their determination, he agreed to do what he could to help. Kermit's plan was to lower the empty dugouts down the falls with ropes while the camaradas carried the baggage over the steep canyon cliffs. In order to make the plan even feasible, the men first had to whittle down their cargo yet again. This purge, the fourth since their expedition had begun, was particularly difficult because there was little left that they could afford to lose. Nonetheless, the men examined their baggage with miser's eyes, cutting down everything except the food, Kermit wrote in his diary. Roosevelt kept only 2 small bags. One was his cartridge bag, which, along with his cartridges, held the head, net, and gauntlets that he used to protect himself while he wrote. That was keeping the mosquitoes and bugs off him. The other bag, a duffel, contained his cot, a blanket, and a mosquito net, as well as a meager set of personal items: a single pair of pajamas, 1 extra pair of underwear, a pair of socks, 6 handkerchiefs, his wash kit, his pocket medicine case, some gun grease, adhesive plaster, a bottle of fly dope, needles and thread, that stuff. He gave the shoes he had been wearing to Kermit, whose own shoes had finally disintegrated, and pulled on his only spare pair. Who gave him those? Theodore? With the expedition's supplies cut down to the barest necessities, Lyra and Kermit climbed to the top of the gorge and prepared to lower the dugout canoes. Although they had used this method to hoist their boats over falls in the past, they had never before been forced to work in such extreme circumstances. The canyon walls were so steep, an almost vertical line from ridge to river, that at times the men had to cling to narrow, crumbling rock shelves while they struggled with the rough ropes and their massive cargo. The work was not only difficult and laborious in the extreme, but hazardous. The chances that the dugouts would not survive the ordeal, moreover, was very high. The men understood that, even if the plan worked, they might still end up spending several days at the other end of the gorge building new canoes. The canyon walls were also too far and too steep for a cargo carry. Instead of walking along the river as they had in the past, they'd have to walk a distance of more than 350 feet up the side and over the top of the densely forested mountain.
Jeez.
So it was a 350-foot climb through the up and then down on the route they choose, not along the riverside, basically. So it's uphill and then down. While Kermit and Lyra struggled with the canoes, Rondon and a team of camaradas began to scout out a path. At the summit, Rondon stopped and ordered his men to cut down a few trees so that he could have an unimpeded view of the horizon.
You, chop trees, better view.
What he and later Cherry saw from that mountaintop only made their situation seem more hopeless than they already believed it to be. In the valley below, we could see the river Roosevelt, rushing like an arrow of light straight away toward the distant hills, there to disappear into the somber forest. It was a beautiful view, but it filled everyone with dread. We had learned that wherever the river entered among the hills, it meant rapids and cataracts, and our strength and courage alike were almost exhausted. We again discussed the possibility of having to abandon our canoes, but dreaded to think what our fate would be should we be forced to do so.
Not good.
It took 4 days, but the expedition's men, baggage, and canoes finally emerged from the northern end of the canyon on April 1. Although this extraordinary achievement had likely saved their lives, there was no celebration. The men were too exhausted and sick, and they had not escaped from the canyon unscathed. On the 3rd day of the portage, Kermit and Lyra, in spite of all they had done to protect their precious cargo, had watched helplessly as one of their dugouts had slipped from its rope and was smashed among the rocks on the river's bottom. To add to the men's unhappiness on their first night beyond the gorge, the heavens opened, and they were swept in a rainstorm that was so punishing that even Rondon referred to it as tempestuous. It rained so hard that the canvas awnings and the men had rigged up collapsed, and and they feared that the remaining canoes would be swamped and lost in the storm. Roosevelt laid in his cot, shivering from fever. The men began the next day, April 2nd, more exhausted than they had ever been, following 4 days of perilous portage and a terrible night's sleep. So it was 4 days of portage versus abandon ship and just walk to the jungle.
And they still end up losing one of their 6 boats.
Yeah. But like the author said, it likely saved their lives. Doing it the hard way. Like just getting through it. I think often, things that look impossible are not that impossible once you break them down. Anytime we forge over land, I'm often surprised that when I break down the approach and we start looking at terrain, and all of a sudden, over time you're like, okay, this is doable. We can find a way through. He says, although they looked forward to their return to the river, it brought with it little opportunity for rest. With only 5 canoes, everyone but Roosevelt and the paddlers had to walk. After less than 2 miles, moreover, the expedition reached yet another steep-sided canyon. Instead of getting out of the hills at once, we hoped to do, we were deeper in among them. That's what Cherry wrote. By that point, the men had been fighting rapids for a month straight, since March 2nd, so it's April 2nd. During that month, they had made only 68 miles and descended nearly 500 feet. Worse than this portage, or even the last, was the probability that countless more awaited them downstream. No one can tell how many times the task will have to be repeated, or when it will end, or whether the flood will hold out, Roosevelt wrote. Or whether the food will hold out, Roosevelt wrote. Every hour of work in the rapids is fraught with the possibility of the gravest disaster, and yet it is imperatively necessary to attempt it. Failure to get through means death by disease or starvation.
Jeez. Got to shoot the rapids so you don't starve to death.
Yeah, basically.
It's not a good place to be.
So, we're going to get into this fella here. I'll read this little section here. The brutal job of getting through and around the rapids had begun to destroy what remained not only of the Camaradas' health, but also of their hope. Each new series of rapids reminded them of their drowned companion Simplicio, and each portage held the threat of snake or Indian attack and the promise of heartbreaking toil. So dejected were the Camaradas that they began asking the officers if they really believed that they would ever get out of the jungle alive. The officers were as frightened and unsure as their men, but felt obliged to put on a brave face. We had to cheer them up as best we could, Roosevelt wrote. From the beginning of the expedition, Roosevelt had worried about the Camaradas and done what he could to bolster their spirits. In the weeks of trying hardships, when the fates seemed all against us, despite the fever and dysentery that were sapping his strength, he never failed day after day to make inquiry about his camp companions, including the canoemen and camp helpers, Cherry wrote of Roosevelt. Early on, Roosevelt had begun giving the Camaradas chocolate bars at noon from his meager supply. The men treasured this treat so much that instead of immediately devouring it, they would hoard it until 3 p.m., when they would make it into a mid-afternoon meal. It was a strange form of food for the Brazilian interior, and was especially enjoyed by the laborers, Rondon wrote. Those little daily acts of thoughtfulness were much appreciated, and the men soon loved him. Now that their food supplies were so low and their chances for survival worsening, the ailing Roosevelt did more than give the Camaradas chocolate. He began to give them his own share of rations. When Kermit and Cherry realized what he was doing and protested, Roosevelt simply replied, "I can't do anything to help, and they need the food." We had to watch him constantly, Cherry wrote. It reached the point where if he didn't eat all of his share, either Kermit or I would take what was left and guard it until a later meal. We had so very little that every mouthful counted. By this point in the expedition, many of the Camaradas had become visibly depressed. No kidding. And the officers worried about their sullen attitudes and deteriorating morale. A sense of gloom pervaded the camp, Cherry wrote. On March 30, Kermit had written in his diary that the men were very disheartened. Rondon insisted that they were still in good spirits, but even he had to admit the rapids were causing considerable suffering to our men, in that with very few exceptions they had broken down. The officers knew that frightened and unhappy men were not only hard to motivate, but potentially dangerous. Outnumbering the officers by more than 2-1, and with no possibility of outside interference, the camaradas could easily wrestle control of the expedition from their commanders.
And then what?
Rondon had fought against mutiny and its precursors, fear and frustration, his entire career. He knew its signs, and he knew that this expedition had all the right ingredients for it. Cherry, too, had enough experience with disgruntled camaradas to be wary of them. During an earlier expedition, a man he had dismissed from his team of guides had tried to kill him. In an exchange of gunfire, Cherry had ended up killing the man instead, but not before being seriously wounded. He had nearly bled to death trying to get to help, and he would never again have complete use of one of his arms.
Dang.
The officers of the River of Doubt were fortunate. With very few exceptions, their camaradas were good, decent, and trustworthy men. As the few weeks had passed, however, and their situation had steadily worsened, they had grown increasingly desperate. Under such conditions, Roosevelt wrote, whatever is evil in men's natures comes to the front.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yep. So,
I wonder what happens next. Oh.
We're in the next chapter is He Who Kills Must Die.
Oh. Wonder what happens.
All right, folks. Hope you're enjoying the series. If you like our show and you want to support us, use the codes in the description field of the YouTube video below. Use the code GRITTY Gritty Goat at Goat Knives, like we said at the outset. Get yourself one of these sweet knives. Or use the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops or Stealthy Nutrition. Check out the Stealthy Hunter rifle cover. Use the code GRITTY over there, and the code GRITTY over at Dark Energy. Yeah, that's disgusting. Leave that blister alone. And that's it for today. Tune in to the next episode. It's going to get good. We're almost done with the book. Do they make it out alive? You shall find out soon. Thanks for tuning in. Stay gritty.